I'm talking with Fred Turner, who is the Associate Professor of Communication and Director of the Science, Technology, and Society program at Stanford University. He's the author of a book that means a lot to me, From Counterculture to Cyberculture, in which he looked at the origins of today's digital culture, World Wide Web culture, in the counterculture specifically of Stuart Brand and the Whole Earth catalog. And he's got a new book out called The Democratic Surround, Multimedia and American Liberalism from World War II to the Psychedelic 60s. So the subtitle itself tells to those of us who are familiar with your other book that this is kind of a prequel.
hmm
And what I'd like to ask you to do at the beginning is to zoom back. You've got a whole arc here from before World War II to the to Google. Um, Briefly, how would you describe that whole arc from WW2 to WWW, if you want to put it that way?
Sure. Thanks, Howard. I'll give it a shot. I think we live at a time now where we are surrounded by individual screens, cell phones, personal computers, laptops, iPods. These screens are just around us at all times, and we're asked to engage with them individually. And we're promised by the makers of the screens and by our friends that engaging with screens will let us join a broader community, become ever more ourselves, become more independent individuals, and individuals who are at the same time more connected to loose networks of others like ourselves. That promise emerges during World War II as a vision that is opposed to the fascist vision of a top-down, hierarchical, bureaucratic mass society. That pushback against top-down, hierarchical bureaucracy travels right through the Cold War, the counterculture, and the development of small-scale computing to infuse the world we inhabit today.
It's interesting that you start with a couple of characters who were celebrated by Stuart Brand, friends of Stuart Brand's, Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson, who were for a long time married and did a lot of pioneering in anthropology that doesn't really have to do with this, but somehow intersected with American foreign policy or propaganda. How did this idea of a kind of a democratic personality begin to come from their work?
Great. So Margaret Mead was a leading anthropologist in the mid-20th century. She was also a student of another anthropologist named Franz Boas. Franz Boas believed that the individual personalities of citizens were themselves the core organizing forces behind the structure of societies that they inhabited. So for Margaret Mead and other anthropologists like Bateson associated with this culture and personality movement, there was an understanding that if you could simply see into the individual personalities of citizens, you could see into the rules of their culture. Likewise, if you could change and shape personalities, you could change and shape cultures. To make a more democratic society, which is something that Mead very much treasured, as did Bateson, what they thought you might need to do was figure out how to change the psyches, turn the psyches of individual citizens in a more democratic direction.
There's an interesting contradiction there that I think we'll cover when we talk a little bit about democracy, liberalism, and consumerism. It's
Mhm.
this kind of tension between celebrating democracy and individual liberty and manipulating it in a sense, manipulating the environment to encourage it. And you do a really great kind of historical detective job here of pulling together several different forces and some, I think fairly obscure source materials to show how different vectors came together. And let's just talk about each of them briefly. There's the Bauhaus. There's the Museum of Modern Art,
Yep.
interestingly. There's that very interesting institution that not as many people have heard of, Black Mountain College. And
Mhm.
then there's the Family of Man, which I think many
Yeah.
people have heard of. Probably most people know about that. And they kind of come together into this, what you ended up calling the democratic surround. So let's start with the Bauhaus. How does the Bauhaus and this idea of training the senses and the new man come into this American personality story?
Sure. So at the start of World War II, Margaret Mead, Gregory Bateson, and other advisors to the government face a problem. They believe, as do many American journalists and other analysts, that mass media quite literally make us fascists. They've tried for a decade to explain the rise of Hitler in Germany. Germany had been the most cultured country on the planet, according to many American intellectuals, and yet suddenly they had all fallen in love with this short mustachioed dictator. How did that happen? Well, Mead and others came to believe that mass media had somehow infused, sort of conjured up our unconscious and turned it in a fascist, authoritarian direction. So we start World War II, and Mead and others want to do propaganda on our own people to energize us to confront fascism and go to war. And yet, they have a problem. How are they going to do that using media without turning our citizens into fascists? Now, some people in the Roosevelt administration actually say, don't worry about it, Goebbels is doing an excellent job, we'll just do what he did, and we'll deprogram people later. That's a serious, straightforward point of view. Mead and her group, notably a group called the Committee for National Morale, which gathered in New York in 1940, they actually say that, no, what we need to do is develop a multimedia environment that will allow individual citizens to practice the perceptual skills that are the core of the democratic personalities. So we should be surrounded by images, surrounded by sounds. We should knit them together in some way that makes sense for us individually, and we should do this together. All right, fine. So that's a theory, great, but they can't build media. Fortunately, in New York at that same moment, there are half a dozen unemployed Bauhaus artists. And the Bauhaus artists have come over from Germany as refugees, mostly in 1937, 38, and they brought with them an understanding of multimedia display, multimedia environments that they had constructed for an entirely different purpose in the 1920s. They believed that industrial society had been fracturing the psyches of German citizens, and they wanted to knit those psyches back together using a multimedia environments. They had very developed theories of these. They had built such environments. And Herbert Bayer was probably the leader in this. Herbert Bayer is a Bauhaus instructor, famous for the all lowercase typography we may know from the Bauhaus today. Bayer developed something called the 360-degree of vision plan, which is a plan for surrounding visitors to museums with pictures over their heads, on the walls, on the floor, at their ankles, all around them, so that they could knit these together. It's a sort of gestaltist understanding of what a person is. So in 1939, 40, 41, those Bauhaus folks were available to the folks connected to the Committee for National Morale, and they worked together in thinking about how to design these new environments. The first of these came up in 1942 at the Museum of Modern Art. It was a propaganda exhibition designed by Edward Steichen and Herbert Bayer. Edward Steichen was a leading fashion photographer from the early part of the century, Museum of Modern Art's first photography curator. And they worked together to create an environment that literally surrounded American visitors with pictures that were meant to inspire them to confront fascism. And it was really interesting. The journalists at the time said, this is such an interesting show. Because it surrounds viewers with images, it is not like the fascist shows which dominate men's minds. On the contrary, it lets you move freely through the exhibition to make up your own mind. And of course, your mind will be made up in pro-democratic, pro-American directions. And this, I think, is the turn that's most important for us. Even as we push back on fascism, back on that top-down hierarchical mode, we open the door to a new managerial mode. Margaret Mead, Gregory Bateson, they were very comfortable with a kind of rule of experts. What they thought their job was to build the proper environment and then let us move within it. We would imagine ourselves as free, and we would in a sense be free because the resources with which we built ourselves had been selected for us and shaped for us by people who really knew the right resources for us to have.
So the plot thickens here. We've got these anthropologists who are looking from afar at the idea of an American personality. We've got these emigres who pioneered what were then radical ideas in art and design. Mm-hmm. And you've got, of all institutions, the Rockefeller's Museum of Modern Art. Only something like the fight against fascism would probably bring together these disparate forces. And then you introduce some really interesting characters who would, I think, be considered outliers when you talk about John Cage and Black Mountain College.
Yeah.
What role did this kind of obscure educational experiment and avant-garde artist have to play in this plot?
Right. So one of the myths that I discovered in my last book, From Counterculture to Cyberculture, was that the children of the 1960s did not rebel against the 1940s. Rather, they sort of embraced a series of ideas that were in that period. And one of the heroes of that old myth of the wild 60s is John Cage. People have always studied John Cage really since starting with the early 50s, when he has a Buddhist turn. He opens the door to a kind of countercultural experience. He starts teaching the people who are going to make the happenings of the 1960s. What people forget about John Cage is that, in fact, as early as the late 30s, he was deeply invested in a highly patriotic rhetoric, in a pro-American vision, and saw the decomposition of hierarchical traditional European music as a pro-democratic, pro-American process. In the book, I actually quote a passage of John's from 1939. He says, "Percussion music is revolution. Sound and rhythm have too long been submissive to the restrictions of 19th century music. Today, we are fighting for their emancipation. Tomorrow, with electronic music in our ears, we will hear freedom." Cage was deeply invested in a kind of pro-American democratizing of sound project. Now, during the war, he starts collaborating with folks from the new Bauhaus. So that's Herbert Bayer, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. Eventually, all of them migrate to and visit and become a part of Black Mountain College. Black Mountain College was a small school known mostly for the arts in Black Mountain, North Carolina. But in the post-war era, it became a center for experimentation with new democratic ways of organizing the school, and at the same time, new radically anti-hierarchical modes of making art. Cage spent a very famous summer there in 1948 alongside Buckminster Fuller and Merce Cunningham. I went back and actually got the course catalog for that summer. It's incredible. Any course you took, you would take with the most avant-garde, edgy artist of that period. In 1952, he returns and stages the first happening. And that happening becomes the basis of the happenings and the be-ins of the 1960s and carries through it the politics of the 40s and transforms it into a politicized performance mode in the 1960s.
I was particularly interested in another strand which weaves these together, that I think also had a lot to do with the Museum of Modern Art, and that was the way art was being taught. And as I told you, my mother was one of those art teachers, and I was one of those students, and it was kind of a microcosm of the story you're telling. If you look at the classroom that I inhabited in Phoenix, Arizona in the 1950s as fascism, if you were trouble, you were thrown out of class and they sent you to the art room, and you opened the door of the art room and you were surrounded. Right. It was kind of democracy. And I didn't realize and my mother probably picked that up from the Museum of Modern Art. That was about her time in New York City. So this idea of art education for veterans as well as children.
Right. Well, so the essential problem during and right after World War II is that we've all encountered fascism on the battlefield, but also for American youth in the military. The military, as many Americans knew, was a top-down, hierarchical, vertically oriented organization that was actually quite violent. And there was a tremendous fear, long forgotten now, of our veterans as they came home, a fear that they had themselves become something like the enemies they were fighting. So how are we going to reform them? Well, in many ways, we're going to lean on the tools that we leaned on to democratize American citizens, particularly in New York and particularly at the Museum of Modern Art. We think of the museum as just maybe a space for the display of art, but it was much, much more than that and always has been. Very involved with the government, very involved with propaganda efforts, and right at the end of World War II, involved with creating the War Veterans Art Center, a center for bringing veterans back home, surrounding them with art training in which they would get a chance to express themselves with guidance, but not instruction, not top-down instruction, but collaborative guidance by teachers. And in the process, they would see their personalities come back together, they would become whole again, and they would become democratic citizens as opposed to sort of post-violent, post-fascist soldiers. That center, in turn, became the basis of an art training movement that's led by Victor D'Amico, a very famous art instructor from the 40s and 50s, and spreads from the museum out into the city of New York and through a series of books and training manuals out into America at large. And I would argue that this is one of the roots of our contemporary fascination with creativity. Creativity in this period is what you oppose to fascism. It's what you oppose to militarism. It's what you oppose to bureaucracy, just as it is in our time. Creativity is seen as the solution to a social problem. It's a psychological principle that you can invoke and bring to life through art that then will drive a new form of social organization that will be more democratic, more benevolent, more psychologically whole and happy.
So now we're in the Cold War, and all of these ideas come together into an exhibit that I think most Americans know about, and if you don't, you can easily find out about it, called The Family of Man. I remember as a kid seeing the book. It was a very popular book based on an exhibit that used these principles. How did that come to be an instrument, I guess almost a covert instrument of this kind of trying to convince the world to be democratic personalities?
Yeah. Yeah, in the book, the Family of Man exhibition is a fulcrum moment that marks a shift from the kind of very liberating democratic surround of the 40s and early 50s toward a much more carefully managed managerial use of the democratic surround in propaganda abroad and to some degree at home as a kind of controlling force. Very interesting moment. It remains, as far as I know, the most widely seen photography exhibition of all time. It opened in 1955 at the Museum of Modern Art. 250,000 people saw it in its first weeks open. It traveled then in 6 copies around the world for 10 years nonstop. It is still up now in a chateau in Clairvaux, Luxembourg. It's permanently installed there. The show was designed by Edward Steichen, the same person who designed Family of Man, using an exhibition display design, just like the one he used with Herbert Bayer in The Road to Victory. 500 images of human beings from around the world at every stage of the life cycle. And what Steichen hoped to do with this exhibition was draw viewers in, surround them with images of others unlike themselves, give them a chance to empathize with those people, and thereby give them a psychological incentive not to destroy the world during the atomic Cold War era. It's a fascinating hope, and it's a hope built on the idea of the democratic surround from the 40s, in that these environments might transform us psychologically and thereby make political change. It's interesting also in that he got images from around the world. He went to Soviet Union photo archives, to American photo archives, European, African, and if you look back at it now, you see an incredible array of people who Americans were thought to hate at the time. So there are Japanese people, there are Africans and African Americans, there are impoverished white folks from the US. All of these are communities that were objects of prejudice in the period, and all of them are communities that Steichen asked us to view in a kind of empathetic and liberating way. As the show travels abroad, it becomes a tool in what I call in the book therapeutic nationalism. One of the things that shocked me most in the archives was I found a document from 1959 that laid out, as a previously declassified document, laid out the American propaganda strategy of the late 1950s in a series of overseas trade shows and propaganda shows. They said, look, these foreign peoples are essentially psychologically ill in some way, with an allegiance to fascism, to totalitarianism, to communism. We need to first assess their psychological condition. Then we need to install a media environment that will transform that psychological condition and turn it in a democratic direction. And then we need to measure to see if, in fact, we've succeeded in our transformation. That process went on in a series of overseas exhibitions from 1956 well up into the 1960s. The Family of Man was attached to several of those, but most particularly one in 1959 at Moscow, the American National Exhibition at Moscow. And that's an exhibition in which Khrushchev and Nixon had the famous kitchen debate. In those spaces, American USIA officials tested routinely to see if, in fact, the movement of the individual citizens around the room had, in fact, transformed their mindset. They gathered a lot of evidence that made them think that they had. The Family of Man is interesting as one example of this phenomenon. Everywhere it went, as it traveled as an independent exhibition, government photographers would go and snap pictures of citizens viewing images. And it's funny because I've seen all the pictures in the archives. And what they constantly look for is a mirroring moment, a moment when the viewer and the picture are doing the same thing in front of one another. Because that mirroring is thought to produce the kind of psychological sympathy that will prevent war going forward. So it's a very utopian hope of preventing war, and yet at the same time, it's an enhancement, an extension, and a tool of a kind of managerial aesthetic that says, come into my world. I've made a great world for you. Don't worry about it. You're free within the confines of the fence that I've set around your pasture.
So this kind of managerial mindset, I guess, kind of benevolent attempt to make people more democratic, combines with consumerism at this point. And you know what? These days, many people think of consumerism as contributing to the problems of the environment, problems of capitalism. But I think many analysts who look at the fall of communism say that the promise that the communists made that people's lives would be better was contradicted by people seeing these exhibits, and it was more like American refrigerators helped conquer communism. What? Everybody has a refrigerator in their apartment, and
Yep.
It's an interesting contradiction that something that I think most people think is an unalloyed good, which is democracy, is so tied up with something that has a much more mixed reputation, which is consumerism, and it had a particularly deliberate origin.
Yeah, yeah, it really did. It's interesting. The push toward consumerism comes after World War II, particularly during the 1950s. There's actually a campaign cooked up by some folks at Yale called the People's Capitalism. And it's then advertised in Collier's magazine, described there, and it becomes the basis of our overseas campaigns in these trade shows from 56 onward. The People's Capitalism, it was meant to confront the Soviet Union's apparently successful gathering of the people's will toward a non-consumerist project. And as we went overseas, we began bringing with us all kinds of consumer goods, and we set those among the media that we also brought with us. So the surround that during World War II had been designed to help us see a variety of images and knit them together in our own personality was now integrated with a surround of consumer goods. And so the kinds of choices that were once psychological now became commercial. We began to actually draw them in and buy goods. And buying goods began to seem like a way to transform ourselves, or at least to transform potential enemies overseas, into allies of the United States. And these two processes, a kind of integration of media images and an integration of consumer goods into our lives, began to become one. Now, I hope you're hearing a foreshadowing of the digital world we inhabit today, in which our media interactions are so ferociously pre-commercialized in so many settings, and the acquisition of contacts and information is so closely tied to the acquisition of goods.
So kind of informational consumerism.
Absolutely.
So now in the kind of the waning of the post-war, or I'd say maybe in the middle of the post-war, you've got another convergence that ties all of this history that very few people know about to what many people know about, that you covered in your previous book, happenings, Marshall McLuhan and the idea of retribalization, the Ray and Charles Ames joining the Museum of Modern Art's efforts, Andy Warhol, USCO, the first Be-Ins. Those are kind of a mirror that convergence of the Bauhaus and Black Mountain College, but they're I wouldn't say grafted on. They're alloyed into this previous effort. Probably most people who were aware of the beginnings of the counterculture and the avant-garde of the early 1960s had no idea of its roots in this pre-war and war. Tell us just briefly about how happenings, McLuhan, Ames, Warhol, how all that sort of led to Be-Ins and the Whole Earth catalog and the counterculture.
Well, I had no idea that the world of happenings and be-ins was connected to the world of propaganda. In fact, the idea is almost unthinkable. I was so raised on the idea that the 60s were a revolution and the 50s were dry, cut and dry, father knows best, black and white world. It's just not true. Cage himself would travel back and forth to some of these overseas trade fairs and be promoted as an emblem of American style overseas. He was a free individual who had broken down the barriers of sound, just as free individuals everywhere were to break through the chains of communism and embrace America. So, through the 50s, the propaganda work on the Surround and the Black Mountain College work on the Surround proceed in tandem tracks with individual people like Cage crossing back and forth between the worlds. In the 1960s, the projects, I think, really melt into one, where Cage goes to New York and in 1957 and 58 teaches a series of courses on experimental music that bring together avant-garde artists interested in new modes of performance that will break down hierarchies, turn away from bureaucracy and bureaucratic modes of traditional artistic production. Those people like Alan Capro and Dick Higgins go on to start doing happenings in New York. They in turn become the basis of happenings like USCO's 1966 show at the museum in Riverside, New York. And that was called The First Be-In. A Life magazine writer actually called it a be-in, and the word just stuck and it took off. And that be-in turn, a multimedia environment designed to help you be more at peace with yourself, designed by USCO and available at a museum, became the basis of the human be-in of 1967, January 1967, which I would argue kicked off the high countercultural 60s that we know so well with the Summer of Love and so forth. But one of the things that didn't travel from the 40s and 50s into the psychedelia of the 60s was a certain kind of politics. I think this is really important. The 60s, on the one hand, totally represent the inward turn that Margaret Mead took in the 40s, the turn toward trying to build a kind of personality that could be a citadel of resistance to tyranny, as Gordon Allport once said. He was a psychologist in the 40s. He said that in 42. At the same time, though, by the 1960s, that inward turn had become so self-focused that it had stopped talking about race, it had stopped talking about gender segregation, it had stopped talking about class issues that were very much part of the 40s. And this is one of the things that I think is actually one of the saddest pieces in the book. As we turn toward this kind of managerial mode and we turn inward toward developing and fulfilling ourselves, we turn away from a public critique of difficulties that occur across different groups in the society, a critique of racism, a critique of sexism, a critique of class distinction. That turn inward, if we just fix ourselves, it will all be well. That turn inward haunts us today. Because of that turn inward, I would argue, we have no language, or at most a very limited language, for thinking about how to use media to reach across the social divides that plague our society.
The thought is occurring to me that this could be a trilogy. I don't know whether you feel like doing it or whether somebody else is ever going to do it, but when you say these things, I'm seeing another convergence happening. I'm seeing the infusion of African American music and culture meets the children of the democratic surround, my generation. And then there's the Grateful Dead. There are raves. A rave is straight out of the democratic surround.
Absolutely. Yep.
And I would argue, and probably you would agree, Burning Man.
Completely.
And Google is maybe the equivalent of the consumerism and American production of the 1950s. Google and its connection to Burning Man sort of characterizes yet another combination of the most materialistic aspects of American culture and our aspirations to transcendence.
I really agree with that. And Google's a great case because inside Google, particularly inside the engineering parts of Google, you have a highly individuated, highly flexible, anti-hierarchical mode of collaborative working where engineers are simultaneously asked to work on Google products and at the pool tables, cafes, restaurants, to work on fulfilling their individual selves and their individual destinies. But even as that's going on in the engineering space, there are workers in the kitchen making just a little bit more than minimum wage who can't afford health insurance. And that, I think, is a legacy of the democratic surround. We will develop managerial environments that are so individually focused that they make it a little bit difficult to reach across social divides or make it impossible even to see them or easier to ignore them. So I do actually feel a trilogy coming on. I'm trying to kind of resist the sensation. I mean, each time you start a new book, and you know this, it's like looking over a cliff, right? You feel just ever so slightly nauseous, and you know you're going to jump, but you just think, oh, no, because you know it's a long way down. So I am thinking of a trilogy, and I'd love to talk with you more about it.
Let's continue this conversation in a few years when you finished your next book.
I'd love that.
Thanks, Fred.
Thanks, Howard.